Hey folks, David Stewart here. Let's talk a little bit about Final Fantasy XIV. Jumping on a bit of a bandwagon that I didn't really see coming. I've been playing this game for, I guess, about a month on and off. I've taken a couple of vacations in that time, so shorten it down to like 2 or 3 weeks. I'm an experienced MMO player. I've played a lot of MMOs going all the way back to like Ultima Online and EverQuest, and I've covered some of those on the channel because I really enjoy playing MMOs, but I often, these days with kids, don't have the time to play at least classic MMOs with their very intense demands on your time. Now, it's interesting that a lot of people are jumping off of World of Warcraft to play Final Fantasy XIV. I kind of want to weigh in on that a little bit and give you some of my experiences. Right now, this is basically an early impressions video. I've only played up to about level 45 or so with my White Mage, and I have tried out a smattering of other classes and haven't really unlocked them as jobs. So, Final Fantasy XIV, this is a game that I wanted to play back when the original version released, but because of timing and where I was in my life, I really wasn't able to do that. I was moving and in different cities, etc., etc. That version of the game is actually no longer available to play. They erased that because it was a big failure, and then we get the current version of the game, what's called Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn, which would be the base version of the current game, with the original Final Fantasy XIV, as far as I know, no longer being playable. Though I think you could maybe create some sort of private client server setup if you just wanted to explore the world, but whatever. That version is gone, and this version is what I'm going to actually focus on. Obviously, I haven't played into the newer expansion, so this is mostly going to be a reflection on the general game design and especially the game design of leveling. If you want input on the end game, I would suggest you check out a channel that actually focuses on in-game content, though, and hear what they have to say. So first of all, this is a game that I think a lot of you have been trying to get me to play for a while. I have wanted to play this version of the game, but I just wasn't able to get around to it due to timing. And I think part of it is that I still have friends who play World of Warcraft, and every time there's like a new patch or a new expansion, Blizzard's always lining it up with other game releases, so I end up playing WoW, and then I'm kind of done with MMOs for a while. And that's kind of been bad for timing, I think. So unfortunately, I haven't given this game the time of day that it probably deserves up until now. Now, some of you have said that Final Fantasy XIV is really like a JRPG first and an MMO second. I actually don't think that's fair. As a person who's played lots of MMOs, Final Fantasy XIV is a very straightforward, modern MMO with almost all of the design elements and all of the gameplay elements of a standard modern MMO. If you were to go play Elder Scrolls Online, you'd see pretty much all of the same game design elements. If you're going to play World of Warcraft, modern retail World of Warcraft, you're going to see pretty much all of the same game design elements. You have a semi-open world, you have monsters that are in that world that you attack, you have quests that you have to complete, and you have classes that have distinct roles, distinct sets of spells and action abilities that differentiate them from others and change the gameplay of what you're going to be doing on your character. This is pretty standard stuff with most MMOs going back to the 1990s. You also have a basic hotkey and global cooldown approach to combat where you press a spell, your character executes that spell, you have to wait a certain amount of time to press another spell or another skill. The global cooldown in Final Fantasy is a little bit longer than World of Warcraft, so the overall gameplay experience is one that's just slightly slower paced, but it's not one that you feel like, oh, I'm really waiting a long time. If you were to go back and play something like Final Fantasy XI or, say, EverQuest or maybe even Classic WoW, there's quite a bit more waiting between actions than what you have with this more modern game. With this modern game, you're more or less going to be executing an action on every single global cooldown and maybe a couple that are instant cast spells that go in between that. So that's the micro level of the gameplay. It's standard MMO style gameplay. The macro level, of course, you level up your character, you gain more skills, therefore you gain more options for how you're going to overcome challenges in the world, and of course the challenges in the world grow with you. Dungeons do get more complicated and more difficult as you level up. Things generally become a little bit more complex as far as areas to avoid, mechanics that you have to actually interact with in dungeons versus just kind of a tank and spank continual clearing of a dungeon. I've even died a couple of times avoiding what should be fairly obvious mechanics for an established MMO player, but that's how it is. Even in the leveling dungeons, you just have to do the mechanics at least a little bit. This is a little bit different from, say, retail WoW, where you really don't have to interact with mechanics at all until you get to fairly advanced play at the very end of the game. Now, one thing I really do think is good about Final Fantasy XIV, and this I think was also the case with Final Fantasy XI, its predecessor from way back in the day, is that you can level multiple classes on one character. So your class is determined by what weapon is in your hand, what gear you have on, and as well as like an advanced class stone that you can put in a slot. So White Mage is the advanced class version of Conjure. So White Mage would be the job, Conjure would be the class, but you can level up as many different classes as you want, as many different jobs as you want. And of course, you would always have the option of leveling up a completely new character. So you could roll a new race, new aesthetic avatar if you want, and do a new class, or you could just do a new class on the character that you already have. It's pretty much up to you. The choice of race in Final Fantasy XIV, to me, doesn't seem to matter at all. Unlike World of Warcraft, where you have lots of different racial advantages and disadvantages and that sort of thing, you really don't have that in Final Fantasy XIV. You can just pick whichever thing you find the most aesthetically appealing and play that. And if you want to play a different avatar for a different class, because maybe you want to play like a large male character for like Dragoon and you want to play a female character for White Mage or something, you can do that. The option is really just there for you. Likewise, Final Fantasy XIV is not a PvP game the way that, say, World of Warcraft was, especially Classic WoW. And I kind of have to differentiate between modern and classic because so much of the gameplay has changed in WoW. But you have one faction. There's no set of player factions. It's like EverQuest in that sense. While there is PvP in the game, it is instanced and isolated like Battlegrounds in World of Warcraft, so it's an option if you want to do that. Now, comparing this to World of Warcraft, I would say the very idea of world PvP in WoW has been dead really since Burning Crusade. You really only got the correct taste of open world PvP back in vanilla, and once they introduced flying mounts into the game, you really no longer have the more chaotic, fun, and in some cases symmetrical open world fights. Rather, what you get is people dropping off their mountain, ganking you, and then flying away. Open world PvP becomes rather an annoyance instead of something that is fun to interact with like it was in Classic. So, but even starting with Classic, you had most of the PvP being moved into these instance battlegrounds. And so it makes sense if you want to have PvP in a game, you just have it in the battleground areas where people really want to interact with the PvP or arenas, that sort of thing. If you want the PvP part of the World of Warcraft game, a lot of people would rather just do it in a balanced and instanced environment like a battleground rather than, trying to do it out in the open world. There was a little resurgence in Battle for Azeroth, but as far as I'm concerned, it's not really going to match the old way. So I'm glad that Final Fantasy XIV chose to do one faction. It felt like for years after the dominance of World of Warcraft, you couldn't release just a straight PvE game. Every game that came out had to have multiple factions fighting each other. Elder Scrolls Online had these 3 factions fighting each other. You had, of course, Warhammer Online is going to have different factions fighting each other because Warcraft is basically a ripoff of Warhammer. But we don't need to get into that in this video. There are a lot of problems to having set player factions in a game, and one of the biggest ones is that you start splitting the player base, and it's really hard to maintain balance. Already in Classic TBC, it's like you have servers that are entirely Horde, the population is heavily skewed towards Horde, and that becomes kind of a billowing snowball effect where if you're remaining on the Alliance side, it gets harder and harder and harder to be able to group up and do things. In fact, way back in, I think it was Wrath of the Lich King, The server that I played on, Mal'Ganis, had become about 90% Horde, meaning there was 1 or 2 Alliance guilds and everything else was Horde. And there were other servers back in Classic, like Arthas, that were like 90% Alliance. So finding that factional balance that allows for PvP to happen is really difficult. So if you just kind of toss that out the window and have a PvE game, you can have PvP as an option like they do in Final Fantasy XIV, and you don't really have to worry about class, race balance, faction balance. All that stuff just basically becomes moot. The other advantage is that you're not splitting the content. One of the things about having Alliance and Horde questing in different areas, there's double the content, and each half of the player base is only experiencing half the content. That's really less than ideal, and it's not very efficient. It's better to have all the content open for everybody to interact with, and indeed in Final Fantasy XIV it feels like there's a ton of content to do. And really at this stage in the game, it feels like there's a glut of content because leveling is accelerated. There's a lot of XP buffs if you're below level 70, and there's items that improve your XP. So most of the side quests you can just end up ignoring. You don't have to do a ton of quests, and instead you can just focus on the main quests and the quests which unlock various pieces of content. And one of the things I appreciate in Final Fantasy XIV is that they have these different kinds of quests, and you can tell what kind they are. So the main quests, it looks like they have this kind of fireball around them, and that is the quests that are going to be kind of part of an overall main narrative, and will also unlock a lot of content along the way. So when people talk about Final Fantasy XIV having an emphasis on story, it really has to do with these quests. The side quests are very standard MMO fare. Here's a character, he needs you to do something. There's a little bit of a story attached to it, a little mini story. You go do the task, you turn it in, you get a reward. Pretty standard stuff. I do like that they also have quests which, due to their icon, will tell you that they unlock pieces of content. So there may be a little quest to go out to a dungeon, and that unlocks your ability to do the dungeon. I kind of appreciate that, or to unlock some other little feature of your character's set. There's also quests that are specifically related to your class. So every 5 levels or so, you get a new class quest. These tell more or less a little story that has to do with the class fantasy. I appreciate class quests. It's something that it started to go missing in World of Warcraft a couple of years ago, and it is kind of missed. It's fun to have something that lets you get immersed into a more of a class fantasy. You know, if you're doing a ninja, it's kind of cool to do ninja quests, or a rogue to do quests that are emphasizing what a rogue is supposed to do. Having played rogue, there's like a quest where you have to like stealth past some enemies and stuff. It's pretty easy and it's not very deep, but I do appreciate that approach. Now, I also appreciate the way that the quests are delivered. If you compare this to World of Warcraft, the quests are delivered in a big text box that you read for the most part, and then you go do the quest. Most people just end up skipping the quest text. In this case, rather than having a big text box that you can read or not read, there's a series of text bubbles that pop up, which are very quick and easy to read. It really gets you to read all of the quest text very quickly. In fact, I found myself reading all of the quest text, where in World of Warcraft, especially with the newer stuff, I just end up skimming the quest text because it's so bland at this point, and there's so little interest in what the quest is asking you to do from a lore perspective, or what that character, there's no investment there. I found myself getting more invested, I guess, in a lot of the little things in Final Fantasy XIV because the delivery of the quest text was like that. Now, I'm going to make another comparison, which is Elder Scrolls Online. ESO has voice-acted quests. So when you talk to an NPC to do a quest, you get a little close-up of them, and they do a voiceover. They talk to you about it. Likewise, you had a lot of voiceover stuff in Tor Online, the Old Republic Online, which I haven't played in years and years. Which one do I prefer? Well, I actually found that I prefer the silent quest text over the voice-acted quest text because I can get through it quickly. It feels more efficient to me, and I like the feeling of being efficient. I really was not very sold on all of the voice acting in Elder Scrolls Online or Tor Online. It just felt like they were taking a long time to tell me what they wanted me to do. Especially I felt this way in Tor, where I'd have an NPC give me a voice acted set of lines that basically involved them wanting me to go, you know, give them 10 foxtails or something like that. Standard MMO quest. I just like the text-based approach a little bit better. There are some voice-acted scenes in Final Fantasy XIV. There are a lot of cutscenes. Some of them are silent. Some of them have voice acting. You can go through them quickly or slowly depending on how fast you want to get through them. You can just click through them, or you can watch them or have them on autoplay. There's a lot of options there. If you're a person who really likes voice acting in RPGs, I would suggest maybe you try out one of those other ones like Elder Scrolls Online. As for me, I'm an old school player. It's not really a requirement for me. It's not a detractor, really, to have a lot of voice acting. It's just something that I don't really need in an MMO. Now, because I'm only level 45 or so, I can't comment too much on the meta of Final Fantasy XIV, that is, the emergent aspects of it, too much. I will say that it does seem like there's a pretty friendly community. Most people I've interacted with have been very friendly. I've talked to a lot of people who consider themselves WoW refugees over the past week. Just a lot of people hopping into the game and playing it because I don't know, there was some straw that broke the camel's back as far as World of Warcraft is concerned, and a lot of long-time retail players are hopping off that train and jumping on to Final Fantasy XIV. But prior to that, everybody who was, say, a veteran Final Fantasy player, they were pretty friendly, pretty easy to talk to and interact with. I will say that the social aspect of Final Fantasy XIV is not very strong from my perspective. It's not that it's non-existent, it's better than retail WoW, but it's not as good as a classic MMO. So if you want that classic emergent social aspect, you might want to take a look at Final Fantasy XI, the predecessor to Final Fantasy XIV, which is still live, but I think is no longer patching, or play some variation of, say, Classic WoW or EverQuest, for example, Ultima Online, or even RuneScape. These more classic MMOs, which are very inefficient and honestly don't respect your time as a player all that much, end up having a lot of emergent aspects that are fun. So if you like that social aspect, if you like hanging out and chatting with people, a slower, less efficient game like Final Fantasy XI is probably going to be the better bet. This game's really efficient. It is a modern MMO. You feel like there's always something to do and that you can always be doing something, but it's not so insistent that you be doing tasks when you log in that you can't stop and interact with someone, or just, hang out in the Aetheryte Plaza and just look at people's costumes, or chat with people, or listen to the little bard songs that they've managed to gather in their adventures. There's a lot of moments like that that are just more like a classic MMO and less like a modern standard, highly streamlined, highly efficient playstyle MMO. So I do appreciate that there's a little bit of the classic feeling of an older MMO in Final Fantasy XIV, but it is definitely modern. So if you're one of those people that's like, I don't want to sit around forming a group, yeah, you have a group finder. It's called the Duty Finder, so you can just queue into dungeons if that's what you want to do. You do usually have to do some quests to unlock those dungeons, so you can't just log in and be like, I'm just going to spam dungeons up to level 70 or whatever. You have to actually do some things out in the world. I will say that compared to, say, World of Warcraft, there's a much more cohesive total world. There's a much more cohesive total game. Most of the game elements seem to interact with each other to provide a player a lot to do outside of just, say, like spamming a dungeon or doing a raid or something, going out in the world and doing lots of different little things, leveling different classes, or just hanging out and goofing off with people. And I think this is a big contrast to retail WoW in particular, which has had a fairly static and honestly kind of dead meta for quite a while now. There's very little social interaction outside of, say, guilded raids, or if you're going into harder raids. Really, World of Warcraft is like you're doing hard raids, or you're just doing a bunch of boring stuff where no one will talk to you. It's a very antisocial experience. Not really so with Final Fantasy XIV. Likewise, there's lots of stuff to do in Final Fantasy XIV, but there's a couple of key gameplay elements that make it so you never feel like there's some over-impressive task list that you have to do. That's the feeling when you log into Shadowlands WoW, which is like, oh, I got to do Torghast, I got to do a bunch of these like renown quests to get my renown level up to buy this next thing. You have this task list of things, and most of them you don't really want to do. Torghast is boring and annoying. You really want to do content that's fun. You'd like to do dungeons and things like that. But before you can even get to those, you have to craft your legendaries. There's just this feeling like you're clocking into a job. Whereas Final Fantasy XIV, it feels like you're walking into a theme park and there's a bunch of things that you can do. So one of the things that I think helps with that with the gameplay is level syncing. So if you encounter a fate, which is just kind of a world quest like from Warhammer Online, if you guys played that or remember that, it's just a quest that spawns out in the world that you can do. Usually involves just killing some monsters to fill up a bar. They have this in WoW too. Like you go to this area, you fill up a bar, and you get experience. Well, if you are too high level, you can sync your level back down to the level and play and get experience and get the rewards from the fate. If you're trying to, you can get different items for doing that kind of thing. You can level sync in a dungeon. So if you feel like, oh no, I'm too high a level to do that dungeon, or you're grouping up with a friend and he's level 20 and you're level 50. Well, you can do the level 20 dungeon together. It just sinks your level back down. So none of the content feels like it's irrelevant as you get up to higher levels. Yeah, the gear that you may get out of the lower dungeon isn't relevant, but you still get experience. So you can level through any lower level dungeon without any problems, or play with your friends and level sync to them without any problems. And it even will remove from your ability to use on your bars more advanced spells. So if you are like a level 45 white mage, and you have the regen spell, and you sink back down to the level in your 20s. Yeah, you can only use like cure. You can't use regen because that's a higher level spell. But that's a good little touch. It means you're really on par with the people that happen to be that level. So I really think that that's a good little detail that they put in there that makes most of the game content that people are looking to do not feel completely irrelevant, like what you get with most of the things in World of Warcraft, at least over the last few years, were like, oh, this dungeon suddenly becomes irrelevant as soon as you can do something better. Now, I can't speak for in-game because in-game's a totally different beast, but for leveling and things like that, it really feels wide open. Like you have tons of options for what you want to do. You can do your class quests, you can do the main quest, you can do some side quests, you can just level in the open world, you could queue up for dungeons and level in between that. If you are a healer, I played a healer, it's instant queues because not everyone wants to play white mage, I guess, so you can get into dungeons very quickly. But I enjoy healing in WoW and in other games. I've always liked cleric playstyles, so I'm quite happy to play white mage these days. So anyway, I think that's a really good detail, and I think that keeps the game feeling pretty fun, and also just reducing the barriers that you have to play with other people. You can pick what server to play on based on, you know, where your friends want to play, but if you want to, you can visit other servers as well. If you find that, make a new friend and he plays on a different server. So all those things are there. You have a lot of the benefits of the modern gameplay styles without a lot of the downsides that come from, you know, the history of a game like WoW or the history of a game like ESO. So moving on past gameplay, talk about the graphics, aesthetics, sound, that kind of stuff. You've been seeing, hopefully as you've been watching this, you've been seeing the graphical presentation of the world. I think it's pretty good. My big downside to playing this game, at least playing it on PC, is there's a ton of aliasing. So there's a lot of jagged edges, and there's no really good anti-aliasing option. Since I play in an ultra-wide format, and that's how I prefer to play games, especially MMOs, where you can see a lot more of the world, I can't play at some kind of extreme, you know, 5K resolution or something like that. That's just more than the video card can handle. I will say I can get rid of most of the aliasing in the game if I run with dynamic super resolution as part of my NVIDIA card. But for some reason in this game in particular, that introduces a ton of input lag. I don't really know where that comes from, but the game starts to have like about a 250, maybe 200 millisecond input lag. And to me, that's unplayable. I can't play with that much lag on the input. And likewise, it really tanks the frame rate in a way that doesn't seem to occur in other games. And I'm not really sure why that is, but this game engine in particular, the more pixels you're pushing for whatever reason, the more taxing it is on my system. Now I can run it at dynamic super resolution at 60 FPS, but basically you have to turn everything else down to 0. So it's either you live with some jagged edges and the poor FXAA, which is kind of like putting Vaseline, you know, it's just kind of a blur filter. It looks okay, but you can live with that and kind of run some filters through, say, your GeForce Experience panel if you're running an NVIDIA card, and live with that and have all the other stuff cranked, like great shadows, great textures, beautiful lighting, and some jagged edges. Or you can have none of that and then no jagged edges. So it's kind of up to you where to decide. For whatever reason, pushing that higher resolution comes at a really extreme cost. If I was playing on a 4K monitor, I probably wouldn't need that at all, but my monitor is 2650 by 1080, my primary monitor. You guys have seen some more extreme widescreen stuff I've done. You can play the game in really extreme widescreen, like 6400 by 1080. It takes a little bit of work to do, and you have to play it in windowed mode, but it comes at a big performance cost again. So I've just been playing it on one monitor for those of you who are like really interested in like, man, I want to play it in really extreme mode. You're going to need some serious hardware. You're going to need a really modern card. I'm running on a GTX 970, which is an older card at this point and actually still kind of hard to come by because of video card shortages. But if you're running like an RTX 3090 or something, you'd probably have no problem pushing whatever graphical limits you want on this game. The engine is fairly efficient for what it is. It's very beautiful when you have everything pushed. Other than that, aliasing. Now, I actually have the game on PlayStation 4 as well. And if you're wondering, why would I buy the game on two different platforms? I kind of figured out you get game time when you buy the game on the other platform, and it was on such a big sale. It would have cost, there was a $7 difference between buying the game on the new platform and like buying another month of game time. So I got it on PS4 for $7, and in that case I can play it sometimes on my couch if I want to, or I can even play it on the PlayStation Vita in wondrous 540p, and surprisingly it plays pretty well on the Vita. So yes, you can play Final Fantasy XIV on the PlayStation Vita by streaming it from your PS4. Don't think you can do it from the PS5 for those of you who have the new hardware, but you can still do it from PS4. The PS4 graphics are way cranked down, but somehow the anti-aliasing is better. There's not as much jagged edges on the PS4 version, but you're missing a lot of shading and shadows and bright colors. It looks so much better on PC, even with the jagged edges. But it's very playable on PS4, and it's surprisingly playable with a controller. This is something that I didn't realize I would like, but I actually really like the fact that I could play it with a controller. Now, am I playing with a controller when I'm like trying to do a dungeon or like be really good at the game? No, I'm still doing mouse and keyboard because I feel that that's a better way to interact with the world. But if I'm just walking around talking to NPCs, I found it that it's really relaxing to just pick up my controller on my PC, either my Xbox controller, which works flawlessly, Xbox 360 controller, or my PS4 controller, which I can plug in just via USB and it just works. And I can walk over and click NPCs and do basically all the basic stuff, and I could lean back in my chair and have almost like a console experience during the more relaxed parts of the game. I didn't realize how much fun that would be and what a cool feature that would be, and how much I would think I would really like to do this in World of Warcraft. Likewise, if you have a controller and a phone and like NVIDIA streaming onto your phone, you could actually stream this on your phone if you're sitting in bed and play it completely playable with a controller. I think they learned a lot. You could actually play Final Fantasy XI with a controller too back in the day, like because it was a PS2 game. Believe it or not, you could play that game on the PS2. It came with a hard drive. So when you bought Final Fantasy XI, it came with a hard drive to install in your PlayStation 2. Wild. Anyway, I go off on tangents with things like that. But yeah, you can play with a controller and it actually plays pretty good. I still think mouse and keyboard is the superior input for more intensive things, but definitely you can play with a controller and play most of the things in the game with a controller just fine. Anyway, away from the controller tangent, the graphics look good. The aesthetic sense is really, I think, pretty top notch. I really enjoyed how different the three main cities were in the original version, I guess base version of the game. So you have like a pirate city, you have a forest city, you have a big desert giant city, and I liked those three different environments. I liked the three different aesthetic approaches to them. I liked the aesthetics of the different races. Obviously, cat girls are very, very popular in the game. I just played a human. I tend to just play humans in fantasy races. I don't know why, but that's kind of where it was. You have the little Lalafell, the little hobbit guys. So all of those have a place in the overall aesthetic design of the game, and I like how the aesthetics do coincide with all the classes in a very Final Fantasy way. If you see a dragoon, the dragoon tends to wear armor of what you would imagine a dragoon would wear, going all the way back to like Final Fantasy IV. The black mage armor looks like black mage armor. So all of the design of the armor tends to really coincide very well with the class fantasy that's involved in Final Fantasy XIV. The environments are really pretty. There's a lot of good contrast with colors. Not so much overwhelming sense of color like you get in some places in some games. Rather, you'll have a green area with some flowers, so you actually notice the color of the flowers and things like that. So in general, I really like the aesthetics. Very fun to explore the environments and very fun to look at everything that's going on. Especially at night, I find that the contrast with the lighting, when you really have the lighting effects on, makes the nighttime view of various areas really one that I like a lot. On to music and sound. Overall, I really like the music. I like the background music in the various cities and all the various zones. I think it fits together really well. One thing I didn't love about the music is the fact that there is battle music that plays whenever you engage an enemy. I've seen this in several games before, like including Aeon, but it's something that gets old real quick when you're doing a lot of battling. You aggro a mob, the battle music starts, you kill the mob, the battle music stops, you aggro another mob, the battle music starts. You don't really get to take in one piece of music for a really long time because this battle music's constantly going. On the flip side, I kind of like that the battle music changes when you are fighting a boss. You get a little bit different, more exciting, energetic music. Kind of makes you feel like you're playing a more classic JRPG. I realize that battle music is something that is part of Final Fantasy. It's just something that I don't love in the context of an MMO, which is what Final Fantasy XIV definitely very much is. There's even music that plays when you mount up. When you get on a chocobo, you're going to hear the classic chocobo theme. And while I appreciate that and it's a nice touch, I don't love the chocobo theme. I don't need to hear it all the time when I'm mounted up. I will say that the way the game is arranged and how efficient it is to fast travel and things like that, you don't hear your chocobo music all that much. It's not like World of Warcraft where you get on your mount and you're on it for like 15-20 minutes going between places. Rather, you'll be going from one place to another for about 5 minutes, and then you'll be dismounting and doing other things. So you're not going to hear the chocobo music for long enough that you're going to like hate it. It's just something that's like, really, I got to listen to the chocobo music for a little while now. There might be a way to disable that I haven't found. So let me know in the comments if you can just disable that little alternate music at some point, because it does get a little bit old. Not something I love in the context of an MMO, but I would certainly enjoy it in the context of Final Fantasy 4, 6, whatever, one of the classic Final Fantasy games. The last thing I'll address in this now very long video is the story. Lots of people have said, hey, you know, the emphasis of Final Fantasy XIV is on the story. I don't really think this is the case. I think Final Fantasy XIV is a standard MMO. I think the emphasis is on the gameplay and the sort of macro level of leveling up and powering up your character and getting new items, etc., and not really on the story. That being said, there is a main story, and it's identified as the main story. So you can go do these main story quests, and they give you a little bit of a narrative and some background on the world of Eorzea and what's going on, and you know who this Garlean Empire was. It gives you a lot of lore background as you are experiencing what is honestly a fairly wandering and not very narrative-focused story, at least in the base version of the game. Now, I've been told that this improves in further expansions, so keep that in mind. It's not bad, but I would certainly not say that it's like a story-based game. I heard that back with the Old Republic Online. That was their big selling point with BioWare, was like, we're going to emphasize your story. And it was just really not there. MMOs are really about like your story, not the story, and emphasis on the story tends to either be kind of flat or ignored by a lot of players, or just bad in the case of a lot of World of Warcraft expansions. So anyway, the fact that I would not consider it explicitly story focused is actually not a bad thing at all. If you enjoy going through that main quest in the story, which is not bad, like I said, you can really just focus on that and do that and enjoy that for itself. And yeah, it's going to be superior to a lot of the stuff that they do in World of Warcraft, but that's going to be the case with almost any game that's not World of Warcraft. Story really is not their strong suit and hasn't been for years at this point. So the story strength, I would say, of Final Fantasy XIV is really the story strength of any well-designed modern MMO, which is that you are interacting with the world and you're getting lots of little stories. This guy wants you to go take care of this task, and there's a little story there. And you yourself are kind of making your own story as you interact with people and have experiences out in the open world. So its strength is going to be the same as really any modern designed MMO, in that you uncover the lore of the world through your interaction with the world, rather than going through some set narrative that's a very, very good story. So there's one little detail I want to mention before I wrap up here, and that is the idling camera. This was a weird little option that I turned on, and it turns out I really like it. Basically, if you go AFK or you have to tab out and do something else while the game is open, rather than the camera staying on your character, it'll start to move around the zone and show you all kinds of different things, like a monster sitting in a puddle, or a monster getting killed by a player mounting up and running around. Who knows? Lots of different things. Just views of scenery and rain, different kinds of weird camera focus in and out. It's a really strange little addition, but it definitely makes the zone feel kind of alive. You come back and you get to see a bunch of people out interacting with the world. It makes you feel like there's really something happening, even if you happen to be away from the keyboard. And that's a sense that I don't necessarily get in a lot of other modern MMOs, maybe because they're less populated, or they're less populated in the leveling areas. But that little idling camera I thought was a nice little touch. So that's Final Fantasy XIV. In general, if you're looking for a new MMO to play and you haven't played a new one in a long time, I think it's a pretty good one. Do I think it's necessarily better than World of Warcraft? It depends what you want. If you want to do mythic raids and that's all you care about, well, you can do one mythic raid for, at this point, 9 months in World of Warcraft. That's the big problem with WoW, is really their stale in-game and the fact that there's no cohesive world. Final Fantasy XIV is going to be superior in that regard, but a lot of players who are only focused on mythic raid stuff, they don't really care about a cohesive world. They only care about doing one challenging encounter for, I don't know how long, but hopefully new content often enough that they don't get bored. If you're looking for a more cohesive world experience, yeah, Final Fantasy XIV is superior to World of Warcraft. Would I say it's better than Elder Scrolls Online? I would not. I haven't played Tor Online in a long time to judge. Maybe it's better than Tor Online. I can't really say at this point because it's been years since I played that game. If you're looking for a more classic gaming experience, something that's more like WoW Classic or something that's more like EverQuest, you might want to take a look at Final Fantasy XI instead. It's a much less efficient game. One of the complaints you'll hear about that one is that they don't really respect the player's time, but that creates a lot of emergent things, a lot of emergent social interactions that are very fun in their own, and you don't get a lot of that in this new game, or really any modern game that's designed around funneling players through a bunch of different content and keeping them busy doing things. Comparing this, by the way, to Retail WoW. Retail WoW is really about a set list of tasks that you have to do, that you feel compelled that you have to do even if you don't want to do them. I don't really get that sense in Final Fantasy XIV as of yet, but I haven't gotten to the end game. So if you're at the end game and you have input on that, feel free to leave a comment down in the comment section and let me know what's up. Till then, thanks so much for listening to this little analysis. I hope you guys will have a great day. New book out on Kindle Vela called The Bright Children. I'm experimenting with that platform, so if you keep up with me, I'll have more information on that as it develops. But you can check it out. I'll link it in the comments down below, or you can find any of my other books on Amazon. Thank you so much, and I will... Oh, Bright Children is a fantasy story, by the way. You guys are watching a video on fantasy. It's a fantasy story. Most of my books are fantasy. Take it easy. I'll see you next time.